Welcome back to another episode of Backbench Drivers. I'm your host, Matthew Fisher. John can't be with us today, but we've got a very special guest all the way from Germany. So we've got George. Would you like to introduce yourself to the listeners?
Sure. My name is Jörg Sobolewski. I'm a member of the AfD party in Germany, and I have been, together with colleagues, obviously, partly in charge for the federal election in 2017 and the state election for the state of Berlin in 2016.
So you're pretty connected to the party. That's suffice to say.
I would say so, yes.
So what drew you originally to the party? What kind of appealed to you from the AfD compared to the CDU or any other party in Germany?
I'm originally a Labour man. My family comes from this area in Germany called the Ruhrgebiet, the Ruhr Valley, and it is a family tradition on my father's side to be a member of the Labour Party, the SPD. And I started my political development in the Labour Party, but very soon I discovered that the Labour Party cares about everything except the working class. And I joined the military. Well, I joined the military. I did my military service, and in the military service, I got interested in the more conservative third position approach of the 20s, the so-called conservative revolution in the 20s in Germany, and then just evolved into a change of mind where I kind of assembled, I would say, an actual right-wing mindset. And there was no party at that time. So I joined a student fraternity, and I did what we call opposition outside of the parliament, basically. And out of this opposition that was unorganized, but very active, very organic, consisting of think tanks and fraternities and so on, grew a major part of what we know today as the AfD. And in 2015, 2016, we had this opening of the border, which is a very interesting case because it was Angela Merkel's unilateral decision. It was basically a sovereign decision of the strongest nation state in Europe. It's a case that is often forgotten. And this kind of led to an explosion, basically, of political activism in Germany, speeches and so on and so forth. And the AfD greatly profited from it, changed from being basically being a national liberal party to an actual national conservative. Some say national conservative, I would say a right-wing party that it is today. And I joined around the same time and never left.
Yeah, we see a lot of these new European parties on the right have taken off, especially in the wake of the migrant crisis. And we see a lot of, especially in the media, a lot of disparagement to parties such as yourself. Do you think that these issues that you touch on, the crime, housing crisis, all these kind of things, do you see this in Germany? Is this a thing people feel in their everyday lives?
Look, it's more than just migration. It's what we call Benedict Kaiser, one of our greatest minds in the AfD, or in the surrounding of the AfD, calls a Konvergenz der Krisen. There is a multitude of different crises, and they all converge now. So we have the war in Ukraine. We have the migrant crisis that continues. We have basically the complete erosion of the very successful German industry landscape. We have the demographic implosion. People just not having children anymore globally. And the left and also the center they don't have any answers for these problems. They don't have an answer for a single one of those problems, and it has reached a level where the average German starts to realize that the future will be unbearable unless there is change. And so the need for the AfD and the support for the AfD, and that's much the same in many of the other European countries, similar parties, arises not only from the fact that people do not want migrants, it arises from the fact that people realize that their entire life, their entire livelihood, their entire chance of success of participation in this society is at stake. And that's also why we are especially successful among young people. We used to have mostly a boomer generational, support group, but now we are the most popular party among first-time voters and younger. We just recently had the first poll that was conducted in a school in Saxony, and in some schools you have over 50% of young teenagers who support the AfD. It's because they know that unless something dramatically changes, their lives will be considerably worse than the ones of their parents.
Yeah, and it's quite interesting on the young people issue, especially considering the European election before the last one. These people went out, the first time voters all went towards Greens parties. That the main issues they were thinking about was climate change, renewable energy. And then 5 years later, it switches drastically towards not only yourselves in the AfD, but also National Rally in France, similar parties in Spain and Austria. Is it purely because of these concerns about people's futures, and you're the only parties willing to broach these issues, that's driven these young people to come to you, or is there any sort of something that you guys have consciously undertaken as a party to draw young people in?
Yes, we. So we are, for example, we are the only party that is successful on TikTok. As soon as TikTok came out, we delved right into that thing, and we built ourselves an audience there. Why did we do that? Well, because at that time we were relying on Facebook, and we saw that Facebook was actively working against us. So we always had to be one step ahead of the censorship and all the measures that were kind of taken against us, so-called anti-hate speech laws and so on and so forth. And TikTok was a very efficient way to do that. And so we jumped right to that TikTok vibe, and especially the last campaign, we spent a lot of money on reels for TikTok, basically. They went viral. And part of the reason why they were so successful was because we went away from, what the Greens or the Labour Party or the CDU, they like to explain their politics. And then they say, look, you have these problems, you have those problems. Your phone, if you buy a phone, you need to buy a new charger. We want to change that. So we introduce legislation, and all phones have the same charger and so on and so forth. But when you're a 16-year-old lad, or 17 or 18, you don't want to hear about those things. You don't want to think about chargers for your phone. You might get angry, having to buy a new charger for your phone, but that's not the issue that really, really keeps your mind running. What you want is to have a coherent view of the world, and you want to hear that you matter, and that there is a reason why you are alive. There is a reason why you are here, right now, why you were born here. And the left and the center, they don't provide any of those things. The technocrats, at best. In the worst case, they're self-destroying culture warriors. And the outcome of this is that there is young people in schools and in universities who hunger for reason, and we provide a reason. And we make it possible to put so much content in 30 seconds of a TikTok reel that these reels are our most powerful weapon. This is this thing. Our argument was always, because our opponents, they say, look, you are populist and you have easy answers for difficult questions and so on and so forth. We say, look, we only need 30 seconds to explain what we want. You need 3 hours in the public broadcasting station. If you need 3 hours to explain something, chances are high you're lying. We need 30 seconds, and everybody immediately understands it. So that's kind of our message, right? We say the truth doesn't need 3 hours on public broadcasting. The truth needs 30 seconds on TikTok. And that works really well.
Yeah. Definitely, that's how I learnt a lot about the AfD, was from TikTok, seeing Max Kra and all the edits. It's very it's a good avenue for people of our similar kind of ideas to spread them. And I just want to touch on, you're talking about how your messaging, rather than talking about policy and focusing on charges, as you said, it was about giving purpose to young men, especially. And we see this in the results. You got strong support amongst young people in recent state elections and European elections, and especially among young working class men. And has this always been a demographic that's been right wing in Germany, or has this been something that's you guys have activated?
When you look at the official numbers, the statistics from the Institute for Sozialforschung, which itself is a relatively left-wing organization, but it doesn't matter. They claim that at all times Germany had 10% of the population that had what they call a closed far-right worldview. But when you look at the past results in the elections or the past polls, parties like the NPD or the Third Way, they never had 10%. They never had 10%. Yet there has always been at least a 10%, a group of 10% of the voters of the electorate who would have been willing to vote for a far-right party. So why didn't they get the 10%? The reason is that these parties were utterly unattractive, and they still are. What makes us so attractive is that we are fresh and also ever changing. Right? It also puts the party under a lot of stress, but we managed to activate these 10%, and then we also managed to increase this group from 10% up. Now we have a core voter base of around 15%, and we have now the theoretical potential that reaches almost 50%. Yes, there is still this block of the never AfDers, kind of. It's also 50%. But the interesting thing is the Greens have the same problem. The Greens have a theoretical potential of up to 50%, and then they have 50% who will never vote for the Greens. So in a way, we see this hyperpolarization of the society that we see in many Western countries, I would say most Western countries, is in a way we're benefiting from it because we increase our potential at the cost for all the other so-called moderate parties. And we kind of gradually drift towards a situation where half the population is willing to accept an AfD government. That's dramatic. That's a lot for us.
Yeah.
We started with less than 5%, right? We lost the first election with 4.8%.
Yeah.
And now we're at 17, 18%, and especially in the East. And that's the actually more interesting thing. People, especially people from the outside, they tend to look at the polls on the federal level. But keep in mind, the German state is organized of different states, and these states immediately take part in national legislation, but they also are the main player when it comes to, for example, the public broadcasting service. So for us, the interesting thing is, on one hand, yes, we want to have a good federal result, but what is almost more important is we want to gain absolute majority in an Eastern German state, because then we can cancel, for example, the broadcaster.
And as you were talking about there, you guys have this strength in East Germany, and we saw that in the recent elections. But there's still kind of an agreement amongst the establishment parties that they won't form a coalition with the AfD. Anyone but the AfD. So you kind of have this hurdle you have to jump where you have to get enough seats on your own to form government in your own right. Is this something that can happen within the next decade or so in these eastern states, you think?
Yes, because there's two I'm optimistic for two reasons. Number one, the siren song, the siren call of um, having a very nice car with a driver and being called a minister of something is a very, very enticing thing for many people from the centre parties. Keep in mind, these people are not politicians. They don't have ideas. They don't have ideals. They don't have an ideology. They just want to do politics for their own sake, or maybe because they want to fix one or two little problems. So the reason why they don't want to cooperate with us right now is because they get the pressure from within. Because the CDU boss, Matt, he knows the second the CDU has a coalition with the AfD in the East, he loses votes in the West. So what he's doing, he's throwing the CDU in the East under the bus. And the people in the CDU in the East, they know this. They know that they are being thrown under the bus for the sake of the party in the entire country. How long are they going to continue like that? How many more times are they willing to get their majority on the left against the wishes of their electorate? I don't think that's going to last much longer. And the second thing is, the German election system with a 5% threshold means that a lot of votes fall on the table. We have polls in Sachsen-Anhalt that show the SPD, the FDP, and the Greens each below 5%. The left below 5%. Sarah Wagenknecht now above 10%. And then the CDU and us. And if you have an outcome, an election result, where you have a lot of small parties and they all get slightly below 5%, then you can already have an absolute majority in a three-party parliament with 38%. And that's within reach. 38% in Sachsen-Anhalt is within reach. So you might actually have an AfD-run government with an absolute majority with 38% result.
Yeah, that's quite enticing. And just following up a bit on what you mentioned about, I can't pronounce the name, but BSW, the new party that splintered off from the left, they run on certain issues, at least from the outside, my perspective, they run on a similar platform as you guys. Is there a threat they could eat up potential new voters who agree with you, they like what you say, but there is that stigma in their minds of, oh, it's the AfD, I can't vote for them, so they'll go to BSW. Is that a possibility that they can steal votes from you?
People thought that, right? When Sarah Wagenknecht, when she started, people thought that was going to happen. Turns out it didn't. She attracts different voters. Sarah Wagenknecht completely destroys what is left over of the left and the SPD. What she actually does, she makes the cake greater. We have a saying in German, she makes she makes a bigger cake for all of us, right? Because what she does, she makes our positions more mainstream. Think of geopolitics, right? Sarah Wagenknecht is an anti-Western, some say Stalinist. She pretty sure she hates NATO. Like, when we started with our geopolitical foreign policy approach of multivectoral foreign policy, of kind of, focusing on Europe and then European autonomy, and then kind of using Europe and Germany as kind of a swing between the bigger states, improving relations with Russia, especially concerning, the energy prices and so on. We were called Putin's henchmen. We were called Xi Jinping's puppets, and so on and so forth. And now we have Sarah Wagenknecht. She says pretty much the same thing. Some things she even says more clearly. And she has success with it. So she kind of makes it more possible for us to actually take our ideas into the mainstream, because she shares some of those ideas. while she's not cannibalizing our voters. So that's actually good news for us.
That's good to hear. I suppose bringing back to an Australian context for our viewers, we have a similar thing where we have a former minister for our Labor Party, Bob Carr, kind of in the last couple of years, he's presented this idea of Australia kind of going away from being America's puppet in the Asia Pacific and kind of having this relationship where we sit between China and America and do what's in the interest of Australia. And it sounds very similar to what you're talking about. You know, you deal with Russia where it benefits you, you deal with America, but you focus on what's good for Europe and Germany more broadly.
Exactly.
And as China grows in power and influence, and we see America's influence kind of waning a bit with the end of Saudi Arabia using US currency to trade in oil, these kind of ideas I only see as becoming more popular, more frequent, and more acceptable to the general public.
Yes.
Do you think, just bring it more to European context, do you think this kind of, not necessarily anti-Western, but pro-European in the sense of doing what's best for Europe is growing in European politics across the continent?
Look, without delving too much into European politics for obvious reasons, we see a shift because it used to be that the right in Europe was notoriously unable to form any long-lasting coalition with other right-wing parties. Nationalism was overarching everything. Nationalism in the sense of, the petty kind of post-war nation state. You stole our land, and then, yes, but you killed our people, and blah, 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 and back and forth, and so on and so forth. And what we see now is we see a very powerful, big group in the European Parliament, Patriots for Europe, and a smaller, but ideologically more closed and more unified group, the ESM. This is something we haven't had in the last 20 years. We haven't had groups that big, far-right groups, and we haven't had an ideologically more or less unified right-wing group. If you compare that to how it was before, I think this shift, this change, is a clear sign that people all over Europe realize that, number one, we belong together. We might hate each other, but we are still the European family, a family of more or less similar cultures. And this similarity is proven every day. You just need to look out the window when you live in Paris or when you live in London or whatever, and you see all these people who've come here recently and who are not of European origin. And there's no doubt that I am very close to, or a lot closer to, a Polish or a French or an Italian than I am to somebody from Eritrea or Somalia. Culturally, and also we see politically we have similar problems and similar challenges. The big obstacle so far still remains Russia. Understandably, the Eastern Europeans have a different view on Russia. But I think that Germany's the right, and the AfD as the German party. So I think the AfD is the right path to balance those needs and wants from the Eastern Europeans and the Western Europeans. And if you manage to overcome this problem, meaning our relationship with Russia, then the path is open for a more unified European approach.
Yeah, and the grass isn't always greener on the other side, as we saw in about a decade since Brexit. Nothing's really changed in England. In fact, in some regards, it's gotten worse for them. They've affected their trading relationship with Europe, which is such a large market. They've removed themselves from that. They haven't been able to secure the border, so they've got more a migrant crisis that still exists and still present through the English Channel. And then they haven't had all of this increased autonomy and all this self determination hasn't actually actualized in anything. Whereas you see across the into Europe, you have all these burgeoning right wing parties who have been seeing success. You know, whether it's Germany, whether it's Austria, whether it's Italy or France or Spain. It really begs the question why in certain countries across Europe there are these elements of to do their own exit from the European Union, whether it's Italy or Spain or Greece. Do you think there is any threat to European unity in the future by countries doing their own Brexit?
I think there's reason to criticise the European Union, and there's many things wrong with the European Union. The question is, can we fix the European Union, or do we need something else? Our party says that this thing is broken beyond repair, and instead we want to dissolve it and start a new program. And the new idea is, we call it the European. How do we call it? There's a weird, complicated thing in Germany. Basically, a European Confederacy, and we state what we want to do on a European cooperation level. Number one is migration, right? We want to build a fortress Europe, and in order to build the fortress Europe, we need a unified Europe. Very clear. We want to cooperate security and foreign policy wise, the common single market, and some other smaller parts, and all the rest should remain where the people actually have control over the politics, so in the nation states or even lower in the regions. So that's kind of our approach to this. Brexit is not in the program anymore. There are some people in the AfD that still want the Brexit. I personally think that's wrong, because unilateral Brexit basically would mean that we would face similar problems that the British face. I mean, we'll still face. My wife's from Liverpool. I'm quite often in England, and I remember when Brexit happened, a lot of the people in the north of England who voted Tories, for some of them for the first time in their lives, went and celebrated, and they say, look, the glory old good days are back, and so on and so forth. And now they have to realize these days are gone. Like, look at the share of the global GDP, the Western share, the European share is shrinking every year. We don't live in the 50s anymore, the 60s anymore. We have to work together. And the other thing that people tend to forget is, as long as you're part of the Western bloc, as long as you're part of the Western system, you can leave the European Union, but you will not get any sovereignty over a large part of your foreign policy and over migration. Not a single plane from England left to Rwanda. Not a single plane. No asylum seeker was ever deported from England to Rwanda under the Rwanda scheme. Why? Well, because they left the European Union, but they stayed in the European human rights framework. And this is just one of the many examples that kind of show how the European states are deeply entangled in this web of what we call the West. And that wouldn't change. The only thing that would change with the complete dissolution of the European Union with no replacement is that instead of having the Americans as their counterpart, at least sometimes, a more or less unified voice of the Europeans, you would have the Americans, and they could play the individual small European states to their own liking. Keep in mind, the reason why we have Turks in Germany is because the Americans made a deal with the Turkish government and forced the Germans to accept Turkish migrants. So we cannot pretend that all of these global connections don't exist just because we don't like them. They do exist, and they keep us in this very tight framework that we call the West. So if you really want to change issues like migration and foreign policy, we need to, number one, break this net, this kind of entanglement that we all are in. And in order to break that, we need a unified European approach.
Yeah, and that's something I would wholeheartedly agree with. Australia ourselves, we're this little part of Europe, the West, and we're on the other side of the world where we don't have neighbours who have a similar culture to us. We're very isolated. and throughout our history, we've always been that little bargaining chip between the greater powers, whether it's in the lead up to World War II when Britain wanted Australia to end the White Australia policy and take Japanese migrants into the country, which would have been disastrous, or whether it's America influencing us against China, or if it's China buying Australian ports, Australian agricultural land or water. We're always at the behest of bigger powers than us. Whereas if we were part of a European system where we had people of similar cultures around us, we would have a stronger front against that. So I wholeheartedly agree with what you guys are trying to do in reforming the EU rather than leaving it. And now changing topics a bit, we were talking a bit earlier around how the AfD was able to be this attractive, fresh, and ever-changing party, and how you guys have been able to grow your vote share. I want to dive into that because that is quite at least in the Anglo world, that's something we haven't been able to really facilitate ourselves. You have, in even the most successful, someone like Donald Trump still relies heavily on an older voter base. He has to rely on nostalgia. He harkens back to Reagan and this good era feeling, and he can't really seem to get out of that and try and build something new. And even in Australia, we have much worse on our far right, if you want to call it that. We have a whole bunch of small parties who all fight for 5% of the vote. They might get a senator here or there. So what is seeing youth being able to, and you being the AfD, have been able to build something that is youth-centric, something that is energetic and exciting. How can we in Australia replicate that?
When I was in Australia, I lived in Australia 2019 to 2020. It was I enjoyed it very much. Loved the country, loved the people. What really struck me is that Australia is basically a right-wing country. Like the average Australian is so much more to the right than the average Briton, for example. Yet there is this interesting gap between the political class and the average Australian. You always have this gap that the political class is always more liberal than the electorate. But in Australia, it's quite dramatic. I lived in Sydney. I was in Brisbane, Eastern Australia, Western Australia. I mean, and the Northern Territory, and it was striking how much more right wing, even comparatively liberal Australians are compared to us.
Yeah, it's something I definitely agree with. It's like you talk to the average person, or you look at the polling. The vast amount of Australians have been against, the current immigration system for over
Yes.
2 decades. Yet we haven't been able to kind of have a party or have anything to kind of coalesce all those people together to have political action. Whereas you guys have seemed to be able to do much better with a lower base of support to begin with.
I think part of the reason is, however, that the situation here is just much worse, right? Think of the mass rapes in Cologne. Think of the attacks, the daily terrorist attacks, because there's the big terrorist attacks that get all the coverage in the media, but there's also the day-to-day kind of hidden terror that people feel. There's just much more pressure.
We are called the lucky country, and that is for good reason. But we do have a different class of immigrant. Obviously, we have these wealthy Chinese, these Indians, increasingly recently, and the effects of immigration are much different. It's more on labor markets and housing markets rather than in the streets. So, is there any suggestions of how to, build that base of support in something where we don't have daily terror attacks, we don't have these mass tragedies? But is there a way we can still build this kind of consciousness on the right without, having to go to those extremes first or having those extremes happen?
I think the main problem that Australia has, and that's in terms of the right wing, lack of right wing parties and so on. You need to lay the foundation, the groundwork, and the groundwork doesn't exist. Do you have a right wing intelligentsia? Do you have a right wing kind of intellectual establishment? Do you have a right wing you have right-wing think tanks. All of those things, I fear that those they lack in Australia. The
Yeah,
left have them, and the liberals have them,
definitely.
but
Yeah,
they don't have them. And
because
that was
that's
because that's what the AfD built on. Right? The AfD didn't just suddenly kind of enter the stage and then everybody was there. No, especially Götz Kubitschek and his Institut für Staatspolitik, these guys have been doing the hard work of day-to-day establishing right-wing kind of mindsets and thoughts and establishing an elite of smart brains who have a right-wing mindset and who work within this framework and so on. And that was a very hard job for 10, 15 years until 2015-16 came, right? I think that might also be a reason. That seems to be a classical Anglo-Saxon problem. I think the British have the same.
yeah, yeah, definitely. Because like you hit it right on the head. Like all our think tanks here are connected to parties. So you have the Liberals, the Greens, the Labor have their think tanks, but these smaller right wing parties that try and vie for that vote share to build it, they don't have think tanks. They don't have largely an intellectual voter base. They appeal to more the working class people, and even if someone who is educated could fill that void, there's such a that'd be seen as a social pariah if you were to publicly say, I'm a One Nation voter or I support Clive Palmer. So you're kind of forced away from that. And that I feel like there's been no, until very recently, there's been no concerted effort to try and build that, that base around parties. So you can have events, you can have fundraisers, you can have think tanks, you can have people who are willing to step up and represent the party in local elections, build the party's reputation. You just have one or two high profile figures who go on mainstream media. They speak a lot in election season. Then when it comes time to actually sit in parliament, they're useless because it's one or two senators in a parliament of hundreds. So I think that's what John and I have been trying to do with our project here is try and build like a young elite who we have these right wing ideas. We're trying to network and build something. Hopefully, we can have the success you guys have had recently.
I think that if you manage to have a situation where people will come and not even talk about a party, they will come together and start reading and discuss, right? And you have this in a city, Sydney or something, right? And there's actually interesting intellectual debates going on because that's what makes us so interesting. Even the left has to acknowledge that our debates are far more interesting than theirs. They're boring. We're not. We're interesting.
Yeah.
If you've reached that level, I think that's when you can actually hope for a party that has a chance to grow up and get power, put their hands on power. Because the empty populism, as understandable as it is, it's like a straw fire. It's like you light a fire made of matches. Yeah, it doesn't grow for a long time. It doesn't give you warmth. It doesn't do anything. What you need to really build a strong log fire, right?
Yeah.
And of course, you need the kind of starting moment of populism. It's absolutely fine. Nobody says anything against populism, but populism alone is like, people need to be ideologically educated. They need to kind of leave with a complete mindset that gives sense to their world. Like they need to understand that the world is based on certain points and has a system behind it. Because if they don't see a system, then they will always use the enemy system and just tweak some little changes here and there and press some buttons here and there, but their mindset will remain a liberal mindset. So you have to fight the liberal mindset. That's the thing.
Yeah. I agree wholeheartedly with that. And speaking to an Australian context, this really this should have happened generations ago. We, like as you've mentioned, we have a naturally conservative population. We have, a wealth of private schools which produce, even more right wing minded people. We have people in business. We have people in academia, not so much academia, but we have a lot of people who are quite gifted, quite talented in the business sector, who think like us, but they're not willing to share it because there's no safety net, to say, or there is no ability or venue for them to vent it. So slowly over time, they get whittled down. They stop. The fire dims in their chest, and they start getting consumed by the system, and then eventually they're indistinguishable from any other person. So I definitely think this kind of discuss these debates amongst young people, trying to hash out ideas, trying to develop worldviews and ideas that are different to the status quo is definitely a way forward that would be very beneficial for Australia. And in trying to link your success in eastern states, so as you were mentioning, in Australia we have a similar system where we have different states and then the federal government. And we have states, especially the state of Queensland, which is quite conservative. They, especially at the federal level, they vote for the nominally right-wing party overwhelmingly. About 90% or 80% to 90% of the representatives from the state are the right-wing party. So how do you, in the AfD, target East Germany? How do you get such a base of support that you become, with the CDU, the dominant party there? And how can that be translated to somewhere like Queensland?
We are so number one is that in the East, the people are more used to political change and turmoil, and due to the history. And you don't have this entrenched. I said at the beginning that my family has always been Labour. My dad's family has always been Labour, right? You don't have that in the East. Why? Well, because democracy only came 20 years ago, 30 years ago. But the point is, the people there are more willing to change and adapt, right? That's number one. Number two, our whole way of communication is not only a hands-on approach where we actually talk about day-to-day politics and how our concepts for day-to-day politics, we do that as well. But our approach is a complete set of values and ideas that give people hope and meaning. And that is what people, especially in the east of Germany, that's where the scars of reunification, as beloved as it was, but economically it was quite a disastrous time, where these scars are still fresh. And we say, you have a reason to be proud. You are allowed to be proud German, right? And we got a lot of attacks for a video that we posted, but basically said your ancestors were no criminals. But we stood by it, we stand by it. And that has changed the mindset of the people, and it just has happened in the East faster than in the West. But it's increasingly also happening in the West. So it's not a specific Eastern German approach that we have, it's a general German approach, just that it works better in the East for now. Future, well, the present shows that there's also a dramatic shift in the West. I will go to Rheinland-Pfalz tonight, the northwestern state, and in there we in some areas already have polls and results that are close to Eastern standards. It's this: people vote for us not because they think that we have the better system to deal with the public transport system or something. Yes, we do have a good system, and I think it is the better system. But that's not why people vote for us. People vote for us because they want to have a different Germany. They want to have a better Germany, and they feel like we respect them. Right? Respect is one of the main things we always talk about. And we target the lower middle class, but increasingly we also get support from upper middle class, even upper class people, because once again, coming back to the converging crisis, everybody realizes something is off, something's wrong, something's horribly wrong, and increasingly people put their trust in us. and that's because we give them hope. And we respect the people. That's the main thing.
And I think that's all rather straightforward. It makes sense, and it really baffles the mind why right-wing parties in Australia haven't been doing this. They go on their campaigns all, we're not this party, or we're not that, we won't do this. And it's all rather in opposition to something rather than this is what we stand for, this is the Australia we are, this is the Australia we want to be. And I think it's any party that...
I don't understand why right-wing parties in Australia don't put more emphasis on identity. Like, we live in a time where people wake up in the morning and they're being told it is absolutely okay for you to decide that you want to be a man, a woman, or a teddy bear. And that's kind of normal, right? We live in times where people look in the mirror and they see they have white skin, and the feeling they feel is...
Yeah, I think it goes back to what you talk about, this liberal mindset. Even the people who are in our right-wing parties have that liberal mindset where they say, well, Australia is, a country built on immigration. We can't say that, my ancestors were immigrants, so these 1 million people from India we're letting in, they're the same as me. So they don't have this distinction that someone like you or myself would have, where I look at myself, I see I'm a native of Australia. This is my country. I want to protect it. I want to do right by her, and I want a good future for myself and for my children, whereas they can't view beyond that, because in their mind, that's red flag, I'm a racist, I can't be saying something like that. Even if they are, if they go on and they talk about, illegal migration, we've got to stop the boats, they won't talk about the bigger issue, which in Australia, which is legal migration. It's visa, foreign students, people on visas, and legal migration.
Yes. It struck me, this whole rhetoric of we're all sons and daughters of immigrants. I found that so strange in Australia, because clearly Australia is a nation of European origin, number one. Number two, it has been, it has existed now for so long that it has also clearly formed a unique Australian identity. And it's clearly not a random melting pot of random people who just happens to be, dropped, like what you would drop, I don't know, salt over a meal or something. It's like, makes absolutely no sense. But listen, Matthew, I have a problem. I have to go.
Good.
Because the votes are over, so I have to go get back in plenary.
Well, thank you, George, for coming on. Appreciate it. If there's anything you want to drop in this description, we'll put it in there. But have a lovely week, everyone. And don't forget to subscribe on whatever platform you're listening to, and check out our next podcast next week. Bye.
Thank you.